So that now brings us to our third frequently asked question, which is, how is night blindness related to Appaloosa coat patterns? So before we can talk specifically about that, we have to be able to explain what is congenital stationary night blindness. What does it mean? So congenital just means that it is an inherited condition, and the stationary part means that it's present at birth and does not change as a horse ages. So it's non-progressive. And night blindness just means that the horse has impaired vision in low light or dark conditions. So what breeds are affected? Well, what is probably similar to the case in humans, there are probably more than one form of congenital stationary night blindness. So what we are going to talk about and focus on is the Appaloosa specific form of congenital stationary night blindness. And to date, 2 studies involving both the Appaloosa and the miniature horse have been published. So what do all of the breeds that have inherited Appaloosa spotting, or that are Appaloosa spotted or leopard complex spotted, what do all of those breeds have in common? Well, the one thing that they all have in common, and some of these breeds are represented here in the slide, is they all have the LP mutation. So while the 2 breeds that have been studied are the Appaloosa and the American miniature horse, because all of these breeds have LP in common, we believe that what we have found in those 2 breeds are true of every breed that has the LP mutation.
So let's look just now at coat patterning, and we'll talk specifically about Appaloosas when we're doing this, but we are referring to breeds that have LP here. Which horses are affected? Looking at coat patterns, what our research has shown is that when the horse has a homozygous coat pattern, that is, a coat pattern that indicates it's inherited 2 copies of the LP mutation, regardless of how much white there is on the body, all the way from a few spot down to a very small snow-capped blanket, that horse is affected by Appaloosa-specific CSNB. In the case of heterozygous horses, those which show oval dark body spots in their white patterned areas, all horses that have these heterozygous coat patterns indicating they've only inherited 1 copy of the LP mutation proved to not exhibit CSNB. They are not affected by the disorder. We also found that horses that are born of Appaloosa heritage, but that have not inherited LP from either of their parents, and so are true solids, do not have CSNB. And likewise, horses that are non-Appaloosas, which of course would also have 2 recessive forms of the gene, these are not affected by CSNB of this kind either. Now, a side question to our main question is, what do CSNB affected horses see at night? What we know normal horses see is quite a lot. In fact, much more than you when you are outside at night. In fact, horses have some of the best eyes of all mammals. Because their eye is very large and able to gather a lot of light in low light conditions. Now, when a horse has Appaloosa-specific CSNB, that low light gathering ability of the eye isn't going to help the horse, because it turns out that when light levels are below what you and I could comfortably read at, that horse doesn't see anything at all. It's very much like you've covered the eyes. And only a very, very bright light, like a spotlight, a flashlight, yard light, or the headlights of a vehicle will show up for that horse. So to give you a horse's eye view, we've got 2 photographs here to compare. This is the same view taken at night. On the left, the exposure of the camera shows that there's detail on the ground. You can see little leaves and stones. You can see a boulder that has some light shining on the top of it. And if you can imagine out being on a night trail ride with your horse, the horse would be probably pretty comfortable. It can see the ground, it can see the hill in the distance, and there's the moon up in the sky. On the right side, if you're with a night blind horse, this is really all it's going to see. There will be a bright patch in the sky where the moon is, because that's a bright enough object for its normal daytime vision to kick in, but just for that little spot. And the rest of the detail doesn't exist for that horse.
So what does this information mean for the breeder? And a question that we often get is, can we breed away from CSNB, or congenital stationary night blindness? Well, what all of our research indicates is that this Appaloosa-specific form of CSNB is caused by the same gene, the same mutation that causes LP. So that means that the mutation that makes Appaloosas look the way they do also causes CSNB. So what that means to the breeder is that homozygotes are affected. Heterozygotes for LP are said to be carriers. That means that they carry the mutation to produce CSNB. They are not night blind themselves, but they have the potential to produce an animal that is night blind. And then we have those horses that are homozygous recessive, or do not carry the dominant version of LP, and those horses are unaffected, and they cannot produce Appaloosa-specific CSNB. So about how many Appaloosas are affected? Most breeding programs currently breed heterozygous horses, so horses that are heterozygous for LP to each other, and that would mean that about 25% of the population is affected by CSNB. So if we take the first two questions together, and we say, well, what would be the result of crossing two horses that are homozygous for both LP and PATN1? Remember that both LP and PATN1 are on different chromosomes, and so they are inherited independently. So if you look at the top row in the diagram, you would see the outcome of such a cross. So that means there are 4 different possibilities of horses that result from this cross that would have DSNB. So those horses are homozygous for LP, and if you look at the top row, the 2 horses on the left, they have also inherited the dominant version of PATN1, while the 2 horses on the right have inherited the recessive version of PATN1. Then if we look at our next 2 rows, you can see that those are the possibility of horses that will be heterozygous for LP, and those horses do not have congenital stationary night blindness. They are carriers, so they can produce animals that will have congenital stationary night blindness. And you can see on that top row, those are possibilities of horses that have inherited one dominant form of LP and at least one dominant form of PATN1. Where that third row, those are horses that have inherited one dominant version of LP, but have not inherited the dominant version of PATN1. And finally, the bottom row in this diagram, those are horses that have inherited 2 recessive versions of LP. While by looking at them, we can't tell what they have inherited in terms of PATN1, but what we know about them in regards to congenital stationary night blindness is that they are not affected by congenital stationary night blindness, and they are not carriers, so they cannot produce horses with CSNB. So how is CSNB diagnosed? Well, a regular eye exam by your veterinarian will not detect CSNB. A DNA test for the LP mutation will, however, let you know if your horse has CSNB or is a carrier for CSNB. However, that test is not yet commercially available, but it will be soon. The other way to diagnose for CSNB is to have a veterinary ophthalmologist perform a special test called an ERG, which is short for electroretinogram.
Now we can move on to some more practical applications of this information. We can look at the care and breeding of Appaloosas and try and figure out ways to help you to protect your investment. We want to make sure that your horses are safe, and we also want to maximize the breeding outcomes that you are making in your program. So there are 3 specific avenues toward best management of CSNB in the Appaloosa. First, you're going to want to protect your horses. Second, you're going to want to protect yourself. And third, you are going to need to educate other people who are around your horses about what it's like to work with and be a horse with CSNB. In order to protect your horses, you need to be able to provide a safe, hazard-free, and well-lit environment for them. If it's not well-lit, if you do have horses out in dark areas, you're going to have to remove hazards. The filly on the right ran into a piece of haying equipment because her owners did not realize she couldn't see at night. And young horses are vulnerable to this type of injury. So make sure that paddocks don't have things in them that horses can run into at night. If you use an injury prevention strategy, not only will you keep your horses from being harmed, but you will protect your wallet from those trips to the veterinarian. One of the most important ways to do this is to use safe fencing. Now, when I explain what a safe fence is to a horse breeder, I tell them, in my estimation, it has to be a fence that you're willing to run at top speed wearing only a bathing suit. That usually gets people's attention. But it's really true because horses' skin cuts almost as easily as our own. So in the example given here, you're looking at a stretchy, very high test nylon line that gives but does not cut. It has a breaking strength that means that the horse will not be injured by it. Also, you're going to want to install night lights so that the corrals and shelters that your horses spend time in at night are lit. And this is important because unless the horse is there by itself, there's a chance that during feeding time in the dark, some horse that's behaving aggressively around the food or around the water might injure another horse. And if you walk up to a horse in such a dark place, you could be hurt as well, simply because the horse might startle or turn around suddenly and step on you. Finally, you're going to want to choose your pasture mates wisely. During the daylight hours, a horse that has CSNB is going to move and behave just like its other friends that have normal vision day and night. But at nighttime, there's always a chance that a horse with CSNB could be bullied by other horses it's staying with. That doesn't necessarily have to happen. Some horses with normal night vision make wonderful companions, and a night-blind horse will use them as a seeing eye horse. However, you need to really know your horses and make good matches so that the chances for injury are minimized. One of the things that we know about Appaloosas is that, like all horses, they have excellent spatial memory. And spatial memory is the ability to remember the physical layout of the terrain so well that in the case of a horse that's night blind, it can move around as if it sees those objects. So a horse that's given time in a paddock during daylight hours to learn the layout of a new space can get around almost as well as a horse that has normal night vision. So if you have a horse with CSNB and it lives in a safe, open paddock, it can run around at night, and you'll probably only notice a little bit of behavior that tells you that that horse is affected by CSNB.
Really important to provide adequate lighting of interior spaces. And so not only would you want to be sure that there were lights in corrals and shelters, but you would want to have lights installed in arenas and trailers, because this can really present difficulties for horses with CSNB. So I like to share a personal story. My horse has CSNB, and before I knew that he had CSNB, we had a lot of difficulty loading him into a trailer until I started turning on a light in the trailer. And all of a sudden, then that trailer was no longer a big black box. And finally, you want to pay attention to your horse's behavior. Your horse will tell you if conditions are difficult for them, and your horse will tell you if they don't feel safe. So you always want to remember that the world looks differently to your horse at night than it does to them during the day, and it looks differently to them at night than it does to you. Protect yourself. In dark conditions, use voice cues, make physical contact, approach from the shoulder, and follow predictable procedures. And when moving your horse from one area to the other, enter and exit dark areas slowly. As an owner, congenital and stationary night blindness, it is your responsibility to inform those that will be working with your animal so that they can be protected as well. So you should let your veterinarian, your trainer, your farrier, any prospective buyers, or anyone else that might come in contact with your horse. And finally, congenital stationary night blindness is not a lethal defect. It is an easily manageable condition. And horses are born this way, and they don't know any different. In fact, most owners of the horses in the CSNB study, those owners with horses that were CSNB affected, didn't even know. And that this mutation that causes both LP and CSNB has existed for a really, really long time. There's recent evidence that has shown that the LP mutation is as old as 25,000 years. So in addition to this evidence that the LP mutation has existed for at least 25,000 years, our LP-carrying wild mustangs are living proof that horses can survive with CSNB. So to summarize the three questions that we have just gone over, we have learned that there is one gene that controls whether a horse will be Appaloosa spotted or not, and we call that gene LP. There is another gene called PATN1 that controls whether a horse will have large amounts of bite patterning if they've inherited LP. And finally, we have learned that horses that are homozygous for the LP gene have congenital stationary night blindness and need to be managed properly.
If you're interested in finding out more about Appaloosa genetics, or you would like to learn more about the Appaloosa Project's research work, please feel free to join us at the Appaloosa Project's educational website. We have a very large amount of information there accessible to the general public and additional information accessible if you join us through a subscription. Part of what we do is working to make sure that our information is accessible to breeders. So if you join our educational classroom, we can answer specific questions. Dr. Bellone and I are both present in that discussion group, as are some other researchers, and we would love to help you with your specific questions about Appaloosa genetics.
We just wanted to take this opportunity to thank you for your interest in our work, and also thank those many scientists who have been involved in this work from all over the world.